Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us this afternoon for our Retail Leasing Weekly Health Check webinar. We've shaken it up a little bit this week, and I am joined by LPC Cresa directors John Reid and Rebecca Pelling for this week.
Hi, everybody.
So Kyle and Ken, they are otherwise occupied at the moment. And you know Kyle from all the other webinars we've done over the previous couple of months. Beck here is the Managing Director of Project Services, and she has quite a lot of experience in this area. And then we also have John Reid, the Director of LPC Cresa, who has generously joined us today. Guys, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jess. So it's Rebecca, and my background is I'm originally an engineer and worked on lots of engineering infrastructure works. For the last 10 to 15 years, I've worked in the commercial, retail and industrial sectors, predominantly representing tenants with premises search, design and procuring contractors and managing the works through to completion. And that includes, large teams of 40 plus people. So that's me.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm John, and my background is running companies. And early on in my career, a couple of those companies were outsourced property services companies, facility management and tenant advisory and project services. And so that is my background. And in the Cresa environment, I am a director and a shareholder of Cresa, as is Rebecca, and we're very pleased to be with you today. And thank you for giving up your time. I'm going to go back to Rebecca.
Thanks, Jess. We might move to the next slide, the first slide of our presentation, if we can.
I'll say a few additional comments as we move to that slide, just prefacing the presentation. Is Carl clearly over the past weeks has focused on the impact on COVID and the measures, the problems in relating, the challenge rather, in relating to getting lease amendments to interim leasing arrangements, and then looking ahead, the greater challenge of looking to long-term structural changes for retailers in their leasing arrangements. Retailers, of course, impacted by both COVID and the pre-existing downturn in the economy and the soft demand, the soft retail demand, particularly in the brick and mortar component. And so that has been the focus. And so this week, as we decided that it would be useful to just swap that focus slightly and look at the premises and the actual place from which the retail activity takes place, and get a project services response to some of the challenges that need to be faced and some of the nasties that need to be watched out for in the lease construction and in the preparation of the premises, joining those two things together. So I hope that's being clear. And so over to Rebecca. We'll be speaking, we'll be focusing first of all on Category 1 works for a leased premises for a retailer, and I guess that that term might not be familiar to everyone. And so Rebecca, if I can start off by just asking, because we're going to be speaking about Category 1 works, can you just explain what Category 1 or Cat 1 works actually means?
Yes, so Category 1 works are works carried out by the lessor on behalf of the lessee, but at the expense of the lessee. So I think, Jess, could we just go to the next slide? I think this will probably just highlight, that's it. Great.
Thank you. And so thanks, Rebecca. So there's a simple definition. And so if I ask a second question, my second question is, right, we have Category 1 works. It doesn't sound very interesting. Retailer wants to sell and get on and get stuff going, and they sort of expect the lease premises to be ready for use. I'm making it very simple. And so my question would be, why is it important for retail tenants to be aware of Category 1 works and the related obligations and costs and how those might be divided between the landlord and the lessee, or the lessor and the lessee? So a bit of a mouthful of a question, but if you can make
That's all right.
something of that.
So I think there's a number of points here. It's often a forgotten or hidden cost when entering into a lease. So a tenant may have a budget for their fit out, and they've reconciled that with the contribution they're getting from the landlord, but without realizing that if they modify the base building infrastructure, for example, the increase the number of sprinkler heads, or they might want to have different drainage points, that the landlord or lessor will most of the time require that this be done by their contractors. And so it's often a cost that is then managed by a third party. The lessor and the contractors that carry out those works have negotiated their own rates for that, and they're not typically in the tenant's favour. And so you can be saddled with large unexpected costs that you can't negotiate on, and that typically are over market. So
thank you.
That's okay. So it's a risk with respect to cost.
So if I link this back to the sessions that we've had, is what we're talking about here is we're talking about a potentially an area of potential nasty surprises for a retail tenant, where we can enter into a lease arrangement, and one can find, if one's not careful, that one ends up with some form of burden for category 1 costs. So it's a technical area, it's a due diligence area, it's a technical due diligence challenge that needs to be looked at. Is one can end up with some costs that one never ever anticipated, and nobody likes, particularly in a challenging environment like we have, nobody wants unexpected surprises. Now we'll come to the solution later on in that regard. But the second question I have for you, Rebecca, is that besides the category 1 costs, is premises need to be compliant, and particularly from many perspectives, retail lease premises need to be compliant. And of course, compliance with the BCA and Building Code Australia is very important in that regard. And certainly what we've found over the years is that sometimes, again, tenants plural, and retail tenants specifically, can end up with some nasty surprises post the signing of a lease in relation to compliance and some nasty costs. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yes. So I think just if I sort of take a step back and talk about what the Building Code of Australia is. So the BCA, as it's otherwise referred to, is contained within the National Construction Code, the NCC, and it provides a minimum necessary requirements for safety, health, amenity and sustainability in the design and construction of new buildings and new building work in existing buildings throughout Australia. And the Building Code of Australia, the BCA, changes every year, it's updated. So it's a particular risk with respect to buildings or premises that are older, that may not be, where the landlord may not be progressively updating their own infrastructure, and or that when you go to tenant that space, your tenancy may compromise the BCA, and they typically relate to areas around access and egress, particularly on fire egress, the fire infrastructure, the location of fire hydrants and hose reels. And so, to get caught out with either a non-compliant based building or a tenancy that incurs additional costs, can already burden a very stretched tenant, that's dealing with post-COVID-19 recovery. So it's unfortunate, but it occurs quite often.
Thank you. And so you can see the link between the previous sessions. Now, why are we speaking about this particular challenge when the overall topic is COVID-19 and the impacts of COVID-19? The reason for that is actually very straightforward, is there's an increasing amount of activity related to lease events of the following nature. So many of our clients, for example, are in this period are undertaking a downsizing of their premises, which are and sometimes relocation of premises, with the soft demand and with the opportunity for retail tenants to try and position their business better is there can be a relocation, even within a shopping mall. There can be a relocation, there can be downsizing, and already we're seeing the subleasing activity take place. Now, the reason for me mentioning that is that each one of those leasing events potentially raises the question in relation to compliance of that premises to do the business that the retailer needs to do. And in relating to the compliance issue that Rebecca has spoken about. And each of those leasing changes, the sublease, the relocation, the downsizing, requires some premises works. And so it requires category 1 works of some form. And this goes to the question of where's the obligation for those work, where does it reside? And notice the heading of this slide says buyer beware. And that's the theme of Rebecca's message to us today, is that one needs to be very aware, the buyer being the lessee, the retail lessee, very aware that you can end up with some I've used the words, nasty surprises without being aware. Now, Rebecca, you've got a quote there and some funny language above it, but then I can understand the English one. Maybe you want to speak to that quote and why you put it in.
Oh, look, I think I have a few Spanish friends, and, over a glass or two of red wine, we've managed to solve the problems of the world. But apparently this is a very common quote, and I won't pronounce it in Spanish, but effectively a tree born crooked can never grow straight. So, a similar analogy could be you want solid, strong foundations, to hold up your building. And that starts with understanding where risk is, and you're moving or ameliorating that away. But if you don't address it in the beginning, well, you're never going to be able to address it later. It's crooked.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'll ask Jess, if you could move to the next slide. So that's the problem. That's the challenge we're dealing with. And this slide is dealing with the solution. And Rebecca will give us some very fine tips in relation to what we as LPC Cresa, how we've learned to handle these risks over the years, and more particularly, how you continue to learn in this COVID scenario, how to handle these risks, with the COVID situation being a moment in time when the tenant has got a little bit more power and a little bit more leverage because of the context that we are dealing with leasing events. And so, Rebecca, my question for you, it relates first of all to the category 1 works and the risks for the tenant. And my question is quite simple. How do you and your business unit, how does LPC Cresa manage and prevent these risks as best they can on behalf of retail tenants, or tenants generally, but in this case, retail tenants?
So if I talk to Cat 1 works, I think experience brings a lot to the table, and one of the key ways that we try to address this is by having an architect as part of our team that knows that when designing the tenancy, that they design it to minimize any Cat 1 works that might be required. So, for example, designing the space. So if the drainage points are on one side of the tenancy, but the architect were to design the drainage points, say for a kitchen, a commercial kitchen, or some other facility on the other side of the tenancy, well, that requires cutting open the slab, possibly running additional drainage lines, and that could be avoided. Those Cat 1 costs could be avoided by working the existing base building infrastructure within the tenancy to meet the brief, but at the lowest cost. So firstly, with respect to Cat 1, I would say an architect that knows how to not fall into that trap.
Thank you. And then secondly, we come to the compliance issue, where we have had many, and Rebecca, I'm sure would give a couple of illustrations, but we've had many situations where tenants have ended up with costs related to making that leased premises ready for their business. And the costs have been significant. And in terms of the lease, they can't get out of them. And so, Rebecca, same question. How does your team and how does LPC Cresa manage and mitigate and prevent, not mitigate, but manage and prevent these risks on behalf of tenants?
I always will have a BCA consultant or otherwise sometimes known as a private certifying authority, to come in and audit the premises during our due diligence phase, working with the tenant advisor and the tenant, and looking at multiple options and trying to understand if we take this space, is the space the base building compliant, and if not, what are the actual issues, how do we address them, and then quantifying that as far as a cost as well, and then getting that pushed back across the table to the landlord so that it's their responsibility to address that.
Thank you. A lot of information.
Yeah, and that's working with also the architect. I would typically, is part of that conversation, and if necessary, I also bring on engineers to help find those complications, and then look at the likely best, lowest cost way to resolve them, and then who owns that responsibility.
Right. Now, I saw a question, and it reads as follows. I'm in the process of negotiating a reduction in size of my shop, with the landlord, and they would like me to pay for the cost of installing a new wall. Is this common, or should the landlord be paying for it? And so this context, just to bring to ram home the point, is we're finding many of our clients, many retail tenants are using the opportunity to downsize, or using some trigger event in leasing, or just a negotiated opportunity to downside, or perhaps take some sublease space, what I said earlier. And this is very common, is the question of the works that get done, and who should be paying for them, and how do you protect against ending up with these costs? So how do you respond to that question, Rebecca?
The landlord should be paying to do those works. And
right.
Also, I was going to add to a recent tenants experience that we're currently representing, where they have negotiated, where it's been negotiated that the landlord will install a wall, and on that wall it's been clearly articulated that there's going to be AV, so screens on that wall for the tenancy, and the landlord documentation only allowed for a non-structural wall, so it doesn't contain the additional noggings to support any AV screens going on it. So, holding them accountable, and maybe that's a cost issue, or maybe they just the landlord wasn't clear about what their contract was doing. But luckily we caught that, and the wall has been built now, and it's able to support the screens that are going to be mounted on it. So.
But that's an excellent example, and that's the type of making it real. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that makes the situation real. This is not theoretical. And one of our drivers in advising tenants, one of our drivers is the removal of ambiguity. And so it's so important, as Carl has stressed on previous occasions, it's so important to be absolutely clear about the use of the premises and how practically one needs to operate that premises, and the fit outs and the structure and the walls and so on, and make sure that, as per the case, the example Rebecca gave, that there's no room for ambiguity, and no room for some argument, or not even an argument, the tenant being lumped with the cost afterwards. That's an excellent example. Thanks, Rebecca. Now I'm going to turn over to Jess quickly to see if anything's come through.
Could I just mention one thing before we move on to some questions, John? Just with the landlord Cat 1 works, if there are works that are required, one way of trying to manage that risk is agreeing a fixed amount to do those works, not allowing it to be charged at whatever the contractor puts in and where it's passed through directly. So I just want to make mention of that agreeing what those costs should be and locking the landlord in for Cat 1 works is one way of managing that risk. Sorry.
And without harping on about that particular example, but it's a metaphor for what's happening generally, is the example that you gave is the tenant would have been very pleased about being able to move to a small format arrangement, more in line with click and collect and so on, would have been very pleased with that. But then would have had this surprise, totally unexpected, and or potential surprise, which was caught in time. So removal of ambiguity. Now, Jess, if I go to you just to see if there's any questions there, otherwise we have some questions which we have gathered in this area from various interactions with tenants, which we could table as well.
Okay, guys. So for everyone who was with us today, please remember that any topic regarding retail leasing, if you're thinking it, 10 other people are most likely speaking of it as well. So don't be afraid to put your questions forward. You can also be anonymous. We have a couple of questions here tabled from your clients, guys. So we will start with Sue. So she touches on the category 1 work topic and asks, why can't I do the category 1 works with my own contractors?
Okay. Look, the landlord wants to maintain, particularly when it comes, to fire, mechanical, the structure and fabric of the building. They want to maintain consistency and the quality of the building. That's the basis behind it. And for them to manage that, they will insist that their own contractors who have gone through the appropriate checks do that work so that it's being done consistently and to the right standards. However, and the issue obviously for the stress for the tenant is that your contractor might be able to do the work more competitively and at lower rates. But, within the lease agreement, you will find they will restrict your ability to do those works. So we have in the past where we have been forced to use the landlord's contractors, the way that we have best done it is we've taken to the landlord quotes from our own contractors and to show where the market's sitting and applied pressure to the landlord. But you can do that when you're a larger tenant typically. But yes, we've had to use market-based evidence to go and argue with the landlord that the rates that are being applied by their contractor and their project manager and everybody else is just not competitive. But yes, they won't allow you to do it because on the basis they want to maintain the integrity of their asset.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. People like to stick with contractors that they know as well as maintain that integrity. So we move on to Ben, which is more of a statement than a question, but he makes a good point. Surely the landlord is accountable for ensuring that the premises is compliant for our use.
Very good question.
Well, yes, you would think that a landlord should ensure that when you take possession of that site, that it is compliant. But I can tell you, there's many a time when that's not the case and the tenant hasn't done the proper due diligence and is left holding that responsibility and the cost and time issues of it. So there was a medical centre that we delivered in a sort of large retail format complex in one of the western suburbs here in Sydney. It was an older complex and their advisor hadn't picked it up and hadn't negotiated some of the non-compliances out. So I agree it shouldn't occur, but it does.
So practically what happened in that situation then, from a commercial perspective and a practical perspective?
Our client, our tenant, took on the risk of making it compliant. And in this instance, it was quite complicated. It was an issue of a hydrant being too close to a switchboard, and we had to relocate the hydrant further away from the switchboard. And there was, some significant cost. We found the most cost-effective way through it, but he ended up bearing the cost of that.
Just on that same question, is something that comes to my mind is, of course, building codes change over time as well. And clearly, I'm thinking about the onus of where the risk resides in terms of the landlord and the tenant. So I think logically, based on what you've said, is one can find a situation where a tenant might have been there for 15, 20 years, a whole lot of goodwill associated with that premises, and then you can correct me, but you could find yourself afoul of some building code. And I guess my logic tells me if that's the case, so agree or correct if that is, but if that's the case, one has to have a lot of foresight going back 20 years and in the renewals to try and protect your the tenant to try and protect the risks?
Look, the answer is having, and I have, whether it's a small retail or a large commercial, I always have a BCA consultant as part of the team. And what has been occurring is that there's no authority or approval process which is triggering the landlords to have to upgrade their infrastructure to meet code. And what has unfortunately occurred is that when tenants go to prepare their, assuming it's a complying development consent, lodge their complying development consent, and then, you know, seek to get their OC, that's the trigger which is forcing these upgrades to take place. So unfortunately, it's being passed on to the tenant through their own, you know, and there's a lot of tenants doing a lot of fit out work, but it's not being passed on to the landlords if they are not upgrading their infrastructure. So it's only, those requirements are often triggered once you go to do upgrade works or fit out works. So unfortunately, there are many tenants that have borne the brunt of landlords not maintaining their buildings or premises to code.
So if I could just comment on that, is not just in retail, but overall, one of our drivers is LPC Cresa is obviously you are trying to get the best position risk-wise into the future, looking into the future for the tenant. And so we would always try and work very hard in defining the risk related to compliance and so on in a way that is better for the tenant and more equitable. That's just as a general principle, I make that point. You've got to exercise foresight and think about what would happen in the future. The pandemic's a good example of that. Is anybody who had a clause saying, if you can't use the premises because of the pandemic, you don't pay any rent, would be sitting very, very well in the current situation. Yes.
If only those sorts of clauses existed, it would save a lot of people a lot of heartache. So yeah. We have a question here from Anne. It's a common question that's popped up quite recently. Could I renegotiate my rental price due to my current situation as I have lost income due to COVID?
Well, that's a general question, and I'll field that if I can, Rebecca, or to make a contribution first of all. Is the word that's used there is, can I negotiate? And the current situation in relation to amendments of leasing arrangements is the clear call of the mandatory code of conduct and common sense is to agree lease amendments in both interim or they could be ongoing through good faith negotiations, not through legal resolution. And so that goes to a core principle of the directive for this totally unexpected circumstance we all find ourselves in. And so the answer overwhelmingly in response to can is yes. The challenge, of course, is that it is not, when it comes to any negotiated positions, two parties start off from different positions. And so the challenge is getting there, and that requires a tremendous amount of skill, using evidence. It requires good faith. Good faith holds one well through the journey and gets one to an appropriate outcome. And so overwhelming, yes. And we as a firm are focusing more and more on the firms which are not eligible for the framework given by the mandatory code of conduct, but all tenancies are eligible for the intent and the principles of the code of conduct. And we are more and more focusing on those who are not eligible, the really hard stuff of getting to a negotiated solution. There's nothing easy about it, but we are pursuing on behalf of our clients is a good faith negotiations, a good faith position as to what the rental should be, what the adjustment should be, and not letting it disappear, not letting it sort of, I suppose, disappear into space, just keeping it on the front line.
Okay, and hopefully that answers your question. And if you need John, Rebecca, or even Kyle once he returns to expand on your issue for you, please feel free to contact me at marketing@nra.net.au with your questions and your situation, and I will forward it on to whoever is appropriate. So we have one more question here from Sharon. We're going back to basics with this question. So we are about to sign a retail lease. Based on what you've told us, what should I do before signing the contract?
Rebecca, I think this is probably based on what you have told us. I think this is quite narrowly focused on what you have been dealing here with the Cat 1 and the compliance. And so, you know, what would be 5 points or 3 points or whatever to help people practically make sense of what you've communicated?
1, due diligence. Get a PCA on, look at your premises. They're not very expensive for an inspection, but it can save you a lot of money. It's like having insurance. Show them your design, see if there's any issues with that. 2, I would suggest that depending on, you know, the type of retailer you are, and obviously it varies quite dramatically between the requirements, but use an architect that is very familiar with your particular form of retailing. Look at what the base building infrastructure is servicing the tenancy, and ensure that it's fit for purpose for you and that you don't have to modify it. If you do, ask the landlord what the costs are, or do your own calculations and cap those costs. That's 3 things that I would do.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is the advice from the engineer. She knows her stuff. Okay, we have another question here from Suzanne, back onto the subject of rents. For rent negotiations, what sort of costs do LPC Cresa charge to negotiate?
A very good point is our basic policy, our pricing policy is we charge market-related rates for our services. And we like our clients to test us on that matter, market-related. We're not trying to be at the top end of the market. We're not trying to be at the bottom end of the market. We're trying to get a fair return for our services with a determination to deliver a superior outcome for the tenant. That's the basic principle. Now, the types of services that require do vary. We steer away from hourly rates as much as possible. In other words, we define the problem and the solution, much in the way that Rebecca has done here, and like to determine an appropriate market-related fee. But then there will be occasions which we don't like, where we would, it's a discrete piece of advice, and it might be appropriate to an hourly rate. So I can quite easily pick that up with the person who can pick it up and understand their particular requirement, and we'd respond very precisely to that.
Very good. So Suzanne and everybody else listening, hopefully that gives you some clarity around LPC Cresa and what they charge for their services. If you, again, have any questions, please send them through to marketing@nra.net.au, and they will be forwarded on to the appropriate people, whether it be John, Rebecca, or Kyle when he comes back from holidays. Okay, so we have no more questions for the moment. Was there anything else that you two would like to add?
No, it's been very enjoyable, and
Yes, thank you for inviting us on.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jess. And it's with the NRA. It's always a great pleasure working with the NRA. We enjoy it very much, and hopefully we can be helpful to the association and your members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. It was my pleasure hosting you today. And everybody, thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon for LPC Cresa's weekly health check. There will be another one, if not next week, then the week after when Kyle returns. So keep an eye on our events page for updates. Good luck with your negotiations and rental situations, everybody, and we will see you again soon.